Live from the KUDZUKIAN studios in Memphis, Tennessee, this is Artivism with your host, Linda Steele. Welcome to another episode of Artivism, powered by the KUDZUKIAN Network. I'm your host, Linda Steele. We are in for a real treat today. My guest is artivist Richard Liu, who is chair of the Department of Art at the University of Memphis. Richard is a Chicano artist who has explored the consistent themes of subjugation of his community in his art. Richard has curated and organized over 50 exhibitions, and he's exhibited around the world, including Mexico, England, South Korea, and Turkey. Today, in this episode, we're going to get really deep and talk about how the arts can bring about change in urban communities and in communities of color. And we're going to touch on racial equity and power in the creative economy. So stay tuned. This is Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network, and I'm your host, Linda Steele. Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network. Riffin' on jazz.
This next gentleman we're talking about has an unforgettable voice.
My sugar is so refined.
Jazz was the happiest.
Yeah,
Callaway went to my school.
Oh, really?
Yes, he's not an alum because he didn't graduate. He had some gigs to do.
Riffin' on jazz on the KUDZUKIAN Network. KUDZUKIAN!
Hey, this is Richard Liu, professor and chair of the Department of Art at the University of Memphis, and you are listening to Artivism, powered by the KUDZUKIAN Network.
Hi, so we've already been talking about this fantastic guest I have today, so let's get right to it. My guest is Mr. Richard Liu, professor and chair of the art department of the University of Memphis. Hi, Richard.
Hey, Linda, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Oh, I'm fine. Thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. Welcome to Artivism. I just want to introduce you to our listeners because, once again, we have people who work at the intersection of art and social activism, but I consider you the real deal. You are a true artivist. And so I would love you to just talk about how you got to be this artivist, how you came to be an artist, and then also weaving into that artwork the social activism.
Well, actually, I came at it through writing. I was a writer first, and wrote poetry and short story. And I think a lot of it has to do with the influence of my parents and growing up in Tijuana, and crossing the border every day for about 3 years. When we lived in Tijuana, my sister and I were going to school in the United States, and my father, who worked as a butcher in the United States, we would get up early in the morning, and then we would go to the border and cross the border. But during that, at that border crossing point, the question of identity was a daily occurrence. You know, who are you? Do you have legitimacy in crossing the border? You know, what are you going to do? So those sorts of questions became very formative in regards to how I viewed my world. So the questioning of my identity, and also being biracial, being half Chinese and half Mexican, and not, you know, completely fitting into one particular ethnic group or the other. My father, who was a strong anti-colonialist, and my mother, who was a very culturally affirming Mexicana, all of that formed or prepared me really to be able to, I think, you know, live a more integrated life, because I try not to separate what I do as an artist, what I do as a teacher, what I do as a father, what I do as a husband or a friend. I mean, it's all regulated by a specific ethical compass that I try to follow. I aspire to follow, and that really came about after graduate school. It was crystallized for me after graduate school when I came back to San Diego from Clemson, South Carolina. I graduated from Clemson University, and became part of the Centro, the Centro Cultural de la Raza in San Diego, which was a Chicano art community, Chicano art cultural center, and I got to meet a lot of the other Chicanos there. And growing up in the United States, there's a clash between, especially if you're a person of color, there's a very strong clash that occurs in the classroom and how you are being brought up. So one of the first instances I remember is probably the third grade when our teacher was talking about Pancho Villa and how Pancho Villa was a bandit. Well, in my household, Pancho Villa was a hero. And so there was this dissonance that started to occur at a very early age. Or when my parents would tell me, remember, you have to be twice as smart and twice as good to be considered equal. And when you're a kid, you don't understand that. But as an adult, the sort of the youthful scales start to fall away from your eyes, and you start to see that there's power disparities, and the inequality has a strong hold in our society. And then you start to understand why your parents and other people around you are urging you, right?
This is fantastic. We're getting to hear really the story and the making of an artivist with Richard Liu from the University of Memphis. You're listening to Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network, and I'm your host, Linda Steele. Thank you, Richard. We've been talking about your history here and how you came about to really become an artist and an artivist. You were talking about Clemson and going in the Chicano Cultural Center. Tell us more about those experiences there.
Yeah, when I was at Cal State Fullerton getting my undergraduate degree, it was a very conceptual place. Mm-hmm. And then when I went to Clemson, it was much more of a modernist institution in regards to the art making practice. And so that was kind of jarring for me, but it was very good training. But my ultimate training was at the Centro. My ultimate creative training was at the Centro, and especially being around a bunch of Chicanas and Chicanos and indigenous people that identified themselves as indigenous, where we would share the source of our pain. And they were able to provide the sort of ideological structure for me to formulate a worldview. And so the Centro was really, I call it my birthplace, mm-hmm. the birthplace of my ideological self. It's my birthplace. We call it nacimiento, to be born, mm-hmm. right? And so with working with all these other Chicanas and Chicanos, being able to share the stories, our experiences of growing up, the dynamics between our parents, the dissonance between ourselves and white institutions, we were able to arrive, right, at how to distill all that information and then to create solutions. And one of the people that I met there, his name is Guillermo Gomez Peña, and I remember, and we worked closely together for a couple of years, and I remember him talking about that artists don't have the luxury of that we no longer have the luxury of working in the studio to create discrete objects. Mm-hmm. That we needed to, and that to create discrete objects that become part of this commodification process where it has a market value, et cetera. That we don't have that kind of luxury anymore because of the sort of world that we lived in. And that artists needed to become citizen diplomats, mm-hmm. Quote unquote, citizen diplomats. And that was a very sort of an awakening of like the potential of what I could do. That's why when I did get my first full-time tenure track teaching job, I wanted to become an administrator so I could exercise that the capacity of being a citizen diplomat. So as department chair and as teacher and as artist and as father and son, etc., to be able to not only communicate other models of cooperation, but to actually act upon them. And so, as I mentioned before, I try not to see, that's what I aspire to, try not to see any differentiation between one role or another. To live in a sort of integrated kind of way, to not live in a compartment, not to have a compartmentalized life.
We've been talking to Richard Liu, artist, artivist, professor, and you're listening to Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network, and I'm your host, Linda Steele.
Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network. KUDZUKIAN! You're listening to Artivism. Artivism features conversations with artists, creatives, and citizens working at the intersection of art and social activism. And I'm Linda Steele, your host. I'm a grant maker, change maker, social venture capitalist, and I invest in individuals and projects that use the arts as a vehicle for social change.
Hey, this is your guy, DC, Funky Politics. We're back. A brand new season, brand new shows, brand new guests. We're going to do it just right here on the KUDZUKIAN Network.
Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network.
Welcome back to Artivism. I've been speaking with Richard Liu, professor and chair of the art department at the University of Memphis, and we've been having a fascinating conversation about the making of an artivist. And Richard, it's time to really talk about social activism. I know you don't compartmentalize your work. You are artist, activist, father, teacher, mentor, friend, all together. But if we could, let's break down this part, because I think it's so important. And as I've said before, Richard is the real deal. He's a true artivist. So let's just dig into one thing I wanted to bring out, and then you can just flow from there. Equity in the creative economy. What do you think about that? What does that mean to you?
Equity in the creative economy, I mean, that is one part of the larger efforts for equity in all things. And to analyze and hopefully dismantle the systems of dominance that are part of our everyday life. And when I think about especially the cultural economy, who's in and who's been left out, where are the flaws in our social structure, whether it's in education, our political system, housing, healthcare, all of those things. You really can't tease out. When you actually, let me go the other way. When you think about all the things, all of the social malformed practices, they're all caused by the same thing, which is, as bell hooks would say, it's white, patriarchal, capitalist, heteronormative, all of those, sexist, all of those sorts of ideologies that become codified somehow, whether in law or codified in behavior, that separate us from each other and maintain a status quo of power and maintain a status quo of powerlessness. And in a true democracy, that should not occur. In a dictatorship, that's the norm, but not in a democracy. And so, how do we share power? That's the key. Not how do we withhold or accumulate more. And so, in my position, as that's when I think of like, well, what are the things that I do? Well, when I co-founded a cultural center here in Memphis back in 2011. It started, and we were teaching youth for free, Aztec dancing, art classes, dance classes, poetry classes, theater classes. All these things were free to our community because Memphis has reached a critical mass in regards to the Latino population to support these sorts of things, and people want to see their lives reflected. People crave to hear their own voice. People crave to hear to see images of themselves or see their cultural practices, and that just doesn't occur in mainstream institutions. Mainstream institutions, for all practical purposes, ignore the cultural and creative needs of people of color, of women, of just the other in general. And so what if left to our devices, then we have to create our own institutions. But how does that work? Well, it doesn't work all that well because the larger dominant institutions have access to all the money. Whether it's through governmental money or through people that look just like them. And so it's a very difficult nut to crack. But if you can bring people together and you can foment a single purpose, people can do amazing things. And so we started a cultural center, and it's still ongoing. And then also when I got here, I helped co-found an immigration advocacy group called Comunidades Unidas en una Voz, and so they're continue to go. And when I participate, because I don't do things alone. No one does anything alone. But when I participate with my colleagues, with my friends, etc., and doing these things, it's just you don't think about, well, what's in it for me? It's like you just sort of identify like what's the need that exists in our community, and what can we do to support people in need. And so, co-founded those two institutions, or when I arrived here, between Dr. Ernestine Jenkins and myself, we talked about starting a African diaspora program at the MA level. Started developing more courses. Or giving the green light to develop more courses in regards to artists of color, or what we call non-Western art. That's sort of a weird binary, but and so sit on committees advocating for cultural equity, for programming that is intercultural. So I see there's like so many avenues for advocacy that need to be explored. I can't just think that, well, I'm going to make art about this.
Right. You are listening to Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network. Where else can you get into conversations like this about the creative economy, about leveling the playing field here in the arts and culture, and how even equity in grant making in the arts? Thank you for listening. This is Linda Steele with talking to Richard Liu, professor and chair of the art department at the University of Memphis. So, Richard, I want to just talk a little bit more about, you've had some really specific experiences as an artist and working with institutions that really kind of clarify what you've been talking about. And I've been lucky enough to hear about these stories, but can you share it with our listeners, some of the things you've experienced as an artist and working with institutions that really help people understand about what we've been talking about today?
Yeah, I've been trained as an artist, through the colleges and universities. And I know how to make art objects. I think that's sort of a given. but as a department chair and as a faculty member, I participate in institutions, of cultural institutions, to advocate for cultural equity. But as an artist, and as an artist as well, but more as an artist, I find that there's not the kind of bandwidth necessary, the intellectual or ideological bandwidth necessary within these institutions to support the sort of work that I'm interested in, which is more of what we call now social practice work, what we used to call just political art, right? Okay. Back in the day. And so many times I do work outside of institutions because I'm not interested in as an artist, I'm not interested, well, depending on the subject, the gallery or the museum falls short of providing the sort of context that the kind of creative gestures I need to make. For example, back in 1988, when I placed a workable wooden door on the U.S.-Mexican border, and then went back to the neighborhood where I grew up and invited and handed out over 250 keys, inviting people to use my border door. That's not possible in a gallery. Or more recently, in 2009 and in 2013, when I did interventionist work at the Nathan Bedford Forest Park, where I worked with a group of people to create this performance. I wasn't going to go to the Brooks to do that. Right. I wasn't going to go to David Lusk to do that. It's not their part of their repertoire. And then the other thing too is that the work needs to be in touch, actual physical touch, in that site in order to interrogate that site. So there's times where the sort of work that I'm interested in doing does not fit within the parameters of these sort of cultural institutions. Now, the work that I'm doing right now, the most recent work, which opens, I think, on the 17th of May, is at the Dixon. And so the work that I did there was actually investigating how their organization works and producing work from that. So I invited board members to sit down with staff members over coffee and for us to talk to each other as a way of making connections. And so I'm interested in those sorts of things where a simple act as sharing a meal, some of the oldest traditions in the world, yes, can start a conversation between people that may or may not know each other, but are working in the same institution and have the same goals. And so how can I use art to sort of short circuit the typical channels of communication and possibly make more direct channels of communication?
We've been having this fascinating conversation with Richard Liu. I'm your host, Linda Steele. This is Artivism, powered by the KUDZUKIAN Network.
The off-year electorate, the midterm electorates, are older, less diverse, more conservative. You have two electorates fighting for the future of this country. And what I'd say to your viewers and people listening in is, you know what? You got to stop that older, less diverse electorate from funking around with your future.
Funking up your airwaves and jamming the good information in your ear. Once again, it's Funky Politics.
Funky Politics.
Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network.
You're listening to Artivism, powered by the KUDZUKIAN Network. I'm your host, Linda Steele, and I've been talking to Richard Liu, professor and chair of the art department at the University of Memphis. He's the real deal, folks. He is an artivist, and we've been talking about the making of an artivist and his experiences and his thoughts and ideas about creative economy and social impact art. And you're going to want to make sure to listen to this interview from the very beginning. So check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and tune in to your favorite podcast provider. So Richard, now that we're closing out this conversation, do you have I'd love you to give some advice to both artists and museums and arts institutions. And I know you have a fabulous story that can just kind of help people understand what we're talking about when we talk about equity and social activism. So would you share that with us, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the one thing that I would like to say to the artists is that they have a lot more power than they think they have.
Great. Love
and
it.
And for them not to, and for, a really dear friend of mine just passed away, James Luna. And I was talking to my students about James Luna, and I was thinking about, because some of my students, come to me and are unsure because of all the sort of the external noise that they hear from other faculty members. And they become unsure about their own work. Mm-hmm. And so I tried, because this is what I think, I try to reassure them that the purpose of them being here or being in our institution is for them to find their own creative voice and to find power in that voice. And I always tell them that that they have a lot more power than they believe, and for them to not be fearful, like James Luna, because he created work in a fearless sort of way. Mm-hmm. And to think about that, that number one, you can't die from making your art, the way you want to. Mm-hmm. And to not make art governed by the strictures of the marketplace, the local marketplace. So that's the one thing that I would advise artists is to exercise that power. And for art institutions is to share power, and for them to really not to if they're going to examine themselves, they should be examining themselves with the participation of the community. Because if they institutions do this all the time, they do a self-assessment. Mm-hmm. And a self-assessment is looking at the mirror and saying, "Hey, how am I doing?" Mm-hmm. That's not how life works.
Right.
Especially with public institutions, it's like, well, let's involve the public, mm-hmm. right? In a debate about how the role of a public institution, and have the public, the community, participate in assessing and also reimagining a future for that institution. And so there was this incident that became very painful when I was an artist in San Diego back in 1990 or 91, something like that. And a major institution there wrote a grant, and they got hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the language that they used to write this grant was actually lifted from some of the writings of one of the members of the group that I belonged to, the Border Art Workshop. And so we had a meeting with the administrators from that institution, and it became very, very ugly. Accusations, legitimate accusations of co-opting other people's work, and then to use it to get this grant in order to support their particular mission of their institution to create a work that was similar the work, similar in aesthetics to the work that this group was particularly known for, but by bringing in what we call blue chip artists to make this work. So they aestheticized this work that was really generated by and for the community, and they removed the sort of the aesthetic accoutrements of this work without understanding that there was like real blood in there. And so it became very, very divisive. It became a very divisive point in the history of, contemporary history of San Diego art making. And the community became divided.
We're talking about power and co-opting of power and leveling the playing field. You're listening to Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network, and I'm your host, Linda Steele. Richard, please continue. I've heard this story, but our listeners really need to hear more about this, your experience in San Diego.
The divisive nature, it was not just institution versus community of artists or community, but it became, the division became between, amongst the artists, working on these issues. And that was really tragic. And this is what I remember saying to one of the other artists, if an institution is acting and behaving in a specific way that divides the artistic community, that's wrong. Those sort of institutions should be uniting and supporting, not dividing. And so some of the artists, because of thinking of their work in a careerist sort of modality, went along with the institution and participated in the institution. But there were a handful, very small handful of artists, myself included, that decided to boycott the exhibition, even though this exhibition was going to travel, even though this exhibition would provide stipends, even though this exhibition, there was a catalog going to be written. We didn't, that, although important to us, the raising voice to an institution co-opting the work of others was much, much more important. And then the other part, too, is the idea of the division of labor, of them giving a paltry amount of money to community artists to do community work with their education program. So it's been relegated, right? So that's been relegated. It's like, okay, the educational programming in this museum is now in charge of all these community artists, the actual artists that have been mining this work and cultivating this work. So they can bring in blue chip artists from Canada or from New York, etc., pay them an exorbitant amount of money to do the work using the sort of aesthetic cloak, right? Without any of the political will, without any of the political analysis, without any of the institutional critique that this particular sort of work was known for. And so then it became this empty shell of an aesthetic utterance that were created by these blue chip artists. But it satisfied the needs of the institution, and it satisfied the needs of the board members of that institution, but it did not satisfy the needs of a community that was clamoring for this sort of work.
And how did it end?
It didn't end well. No. And here's the other part. Okay, so I'm an artist that participated in that type of work, but refused to participate in that particular show with the museum. But I was also part on the Visual Arts Advisory Committee of the Centro. And so we advocated for the museum to share power. And so they gave money to the Centro, not the same amount of money, we insisted on co-curatorship between our curator and their curator, and then we insisted upon co-authorship between in regards to writing the catalog. And so we, through shame, really, through shaming this institution, we were able to, at the very least, right, ensure that the voices that have been held out or ignored were going to be heard, and that the money that they got to support their institution was going to be shared, and that there would be a lasting legacy through this catalog, that there was one division, that there was 2 artists that were left out by choice, and 3, that this sort of work it has become and is an important way of articulating the experience of people in that area. And so we were able to accomplish that, but I had to sort of negotiate myself,
right.
and other artists as well, between trying to live my life within, aspire to live in a sort of principled kind of life, and understanding the power of my work, withholding my work from, and not allowing for my work and my voice to validate that particular process,
right.
versus me as being a member of a committee of another institution, an alternative institution, and negotiating for more power, negotiating for sharing more power with the larger, more well-funded, more established cultural institution in San Diego.
Thank you, Richard, for sharing that story. I know we're coming to the end of our conversation, of our time together today, and I just want to make sure that listeners know where to find you and your work today. So can you tell us what's coming up for you?
Sure. I'm having a show at the Dixon Gallery and Gardens. It opens Sunday, but the reception will be on the 17th of May. And it's a series of photographs and a small wall installation, and it's called Tu eres mi otro yo, you are my other self. And so they can see the work there. And also I'm in the process of co-authoring a book about a project that we worked on back in 1990, the Border Art Workshop, Taller de Arte Fronterizo, and it's called Border Sutures, where we prefabricated these steel sculptures that looked like staples, and we stapled our 2 countries back together again, traversing the entire U.S.-Mexican border.
Fantastic. Look for those. Look for the book and the exhibition by Richard Liu. You're listening to Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network. This is Linda Steele, your host, and I've been having a compelling conversation with Richard Liu, professor and chair of the art department at the University of Memphis. Artivist, Richard Liu. Thanks.
On jazz.
This next gentleman we're talking about has an unforgettable voice.
My sugar is so refined.
Jazz was the happiest. Now, Calloway went to my school.
Oh, really?
Yes, he's not an alum because he didn't graduate. He had some gigs to do.
Riffin' on Jazz on the KUDZUKIAN Network. Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network.
Welcome back to Artivism. We've just wrapped up a conversation with Richard Liu, professor, artist, artivist, and chair of the department of the University of Memphis. We've been having a very deep and candid conversation about art, equity, inclusion, and in short, Artivism. What you heard today was Richard's journey from a writer to visual artist and artivist. We shared a story that illustrates how artists and arts institutions can share power in their efforts to make change in society. And we also touched on how art can be used as a tool for social change, but there are challenges within the broader arts ecosystem that can actually threaten that goal. But as you know, this is an ongoing conversation, and this is really what we talk about in every episode of Artivism. So look out for our next episode. I'm your host, Linda Steele, and you're listening to Artivism.
You will find the Artivism podcast
Network.
At the intersection of art and social activism. Artivism is executive produced by ArtUp, hosted by Linda Steele, produced, directed, and distributed by KUDZUKIAN.
Best in Blue.
There's a picture that's been floating around social media, especially Facebook. That's probably got 7 or 8 little old church ladies standing on the porch, and they all got the hats on, they all carrying purses, and it says, "My first police." The only police that I've ever been afraid of was that group. That was me growing up.
Best in Blue on the KUDZUKIAN Network.
KUDZUKIAN!